Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today we have a really special guest, Janet Singer Applefield, who is a Holocaust survivor who just completed her memoir, and she's here to share both her story and her ideas about remembering the Holocaust and memory, especially to the next generation. So, Janet, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you
So,
for.
as I was telling you, I just got to finish your memoir this past Shabbat, and you made an interesting decision at the beginning to start with, I believe it was 2023, and your experience coming to a school to share your story and how, in the beginning, it might have been a bit timid and intimidating. I still get intimidated when I meet with large groups of middle school or high schoolers. But what was that process like? How did you go from being a Holocaust survivor in America to somebody who is now proudly sharing her story in schools and writing memoirs? And how was that transition?
I started to speak in early 80s after I had um, joined an organization called Facing History and Ourselves. This is a educational group that trains educators in speaking or teaching about genocide. And at first I was not quite ready to speak because I always sort of minimized my story. I felt like, well, I had never been in any concentration camps, so my experience wasn't worthy of talking about it. But in time, I realized that people kept asking me that I should be speaking and maybe even writing a memoir. So that's when I began very slowly and gradually. Today, I speak to over 4,000 people a year. I speak in schools and libraries and synagogues and churches. More recently, I spoke to the Massachusetts state legislature, and that eventually they passed a genocide education bill. And Massachusetts is one of the 23 states that promotes education, genocide and Holocaust education. And I realized the importance of speaking about this and teaching about it because so many people don't know what really happened. So that's
Yeah.
how it all
And
began.
yeah, and before we get to your wider story, which I'm excited to get into, you touched on something interesting, and I just, it behooved me to ignore it. You had said that it didn't seem like it was, worthwhile to share your experience because, you were only at, one level, you never went to a concentration camp. It's so ironic because it's such a counterculture to how I think a lot of people feel today, where today everything is the worst thing when something bad is happening to somebody. And yet your sentiment is actually something I've heard from a lot of Holocaust survivors over the years that I've had the chance to interact with. On a personal level, I never saw my grandfather as a Holocaust survivor because he never really identified as such. But later on in life, when we looked at his story and realized he spent, 6 years hiding out in a barn somewhere in Eastern Europe to avoid the Holocaust, I realized I was like, hey, this actually makes sense to call him in some way a Holocaust survivor. Is that mentality? Do you think that's generational? Do you think that's true across your cohort? I mean, what do you think accounts for the fact that today, when things trouble, say, I don't want to harp on too many stereotypes, but millennials or Gen Z or, people 30 and under, everything is, this is the worst thing ever that's happening to me. Yet you in some way objectively went through the worst thing that can happen to a human. And yet your attitude is still, well, I don't know if this is worthy of talking about.
Right. Well, I, I just didn't feel that I suffered the way people in concentration camps suffered. And I heard, excuse me, I heard other survivors express very similar sentiments. Um, of course, trauma is, especially to a young child, it was pretty um, severe and pretty significant. And then, I did realize the importance because people kept asking me, you know, they wanted to know, people wanted to know. And that's when I started. And also at the very beginning, right after the Holocaust, people didn't talk about this at all. We survivors couldn't talk about it. People here couldn't hear, the horrible things that happened. So it was, everything sort of came together for me when I made a decision that, this is an important story. I want it to be known. I want it to be part of my legacy.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and just for a little bit of background for listeners, you of course know this. In the 40s, 50s, 60s, it really wasn't talked about. I mean, both in the American Jewish community and also in Israel. And Israel might actually be a more interesting case because there was almost a ideological, I don't want to say suppression, but an ideological sense of, this is more of the diaspora, the ghetto mentality, and we're the, proud, Israeli mentality. I recorded a podcast actually about this a couple of months ago, but in America too, it was sort of very hush hush really until maybe 40 or 50 years ago. And so it seemed like it was a really fascinating and difficult transition. I'm sure it wasn't easy for you going through, having to go for 20 to 30 years of not really talking about it to all of a sudden, you start to see articles and books. And of course, Elie Wiesel is, the name that everybody, associates with the sort of proliferation and publicization of the Holocaust, at least in the American community. So starting with your story, one of the things that I was struck with in your memoir is you talk about your experience growing up in Poland. One, I was very impressed by the number of pictures you had.
Yes,
I had
right.
no idea that, cameras were that, accessible in 1930s Poland. So I'm guessing, I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, you grew up in, a relatively well-off family in Poland in the Jewish community. What was that childhood like? Because I think so often we anachronistically think that, Poland for the Jews in 1910 and 1920 and even early 1930s was just this terrible situation and everybody was suffering. But in your memoir, before the Nazis invade Poland, it seems like you had a very picturesque childhood. So can you paint that picture a little bit?
Yes, so I really had an idyllic childhood. I was I lived with my parents, my sister, and an extended family, grandparents, cousins, aunts, uncles. I was the first grandchild in the family, so obviously I was spoiled and pampered. And I have very vivid memories of preparing for holidays, Jewish holidays, going to the synagogue. I had one grandfather that was very religious, and the other was not so religious. And I remember um, the men davening. And I had an uncle who had a motorcycle with a little sidecar. He used to put me in there, take me for rides, take me to the candy store. So it was just lovely and beautiful. And of course, everything came to an abrupt end September 1st, 1939. But those early memories is something that I cherished even during the war. I always knew I was Jewish, and yet I had to keep this a secret, which to this day surprises me that a 7-year-old would be able to keep a secret. But I guess it was so deeply ingrained in my brain, the danger of revealing this secret. So I always kept that secret. But, having these very warm, wonderful memories, I think that's what really helped me during the war. It helped me to be sort of grounded, and then even um, after the war, I had a real difficult time accepting being Jewish because I grew up hearing that it was a terrible thing to be, but it was those early memories of the traditions and the holidays and the family. I think that's what really helped me to come to terms with my being Jewish and feeling really great about that
Yeah,
fact.
can you actually walk us through that because this is also, I could imagine, a huge tension. And certainly Elie Wiesel writes a lot about this also, which is where I'm getting a lot of this, firsthand sentiment. this idea of Jewish identity post-Holocaust. Was it something when you came to America, was it something that you publicly identified as? Did you join a Jewish community? I mean, what was that engagement like?
Um, yes, we belonged to a temple, and we, observed holidays, but I did not feel comfortable with that. And I'm not sure when I came to terms, but it was a process that I had to go through. And I realized that those early memories of the family and the traditions and all that, that helped me to come to terms.
Yeah. Okay, so we're back. We're in Poland. We're in the mid to late 1930s. Before the invasion. What is life like in interaction between the Jewish and non-Jewish community? Did you have non-Jewish friends? Were you freely interacting, or was it very much insular?
Right. So I think it was fairly insular in the sense that Jews had their own organizations, they had their own um, schools. Well, although my father, my uncles went to public school, public high school. I think they went to Hayter when they were young. Um, my grandfather had a large business in town, and they had very good relations with the Catholics, but it was a fairly separate society. People did things separately, um, but I think that the relations were fairly good with Poles.
Yeah, and so then what happened? I mean, from your perspective, I mean, I've read too many military and political history books, but one of the things that I think everybody is struck by is the ease at which the average Pole just sort of allowed this to happen. I mean, we could say the same thing for Germany, but Germany is a little bit of a different case because they had technically elected Hitler, and Germany, with Martin Luther and Protestantism already had that sort of wide history of anti-Semitism. The average Pole, I mean, Jews actually had a great life in Poland in, say, the 15th and 16th and 17th century. I mean, things were booming. This was sort of a golden age. And so, how does a whole society, I mean, is this just a bystander effect of everybody being too afraid to say something? Or was this really this endemic hatred of Jews that was there?
I think anti-Semitism was so deeply ingrained in the Polish psyche that it didn't take very much to surface. So also, I mean, I think a little bit of it had to do with fear of retribution from the Germans. Um, it's such a complicated subject, and yet there were Poles who were, kind, and they were the ones that saved my life. And uh, you know, it's difficult to really know exactly what what went through their minds when they were turning their backs on the Jews. I know uh, one of my grandfathers escaped from our town to Krakow. He had a Polish identity, but someone recognized him and reported him to the Gestapo. He was arrested. He was tortured. They attached him to a horse-drawn cart and they dragged him. That's how he died. So it's complicated, but also after the war, anti-Semitism was really surging, and after the war, many Jews continued to hide their identity because it was so dangerous. And actually, there's one photo of my getting first communion, and that photo was taken after the war because my cousin's father, who found me, maintained his Polish identity. And so after he found me, he wanted, I was sort of a decoy, to have me get First Communion, that sort of protected him. So, they were very, very strange times, very difficult times.
Yeah, of course. So going back to the story for a minute. So just for listeners' background, in 1939, in the fall, the Nazis invade Poland, and then what happened to you personally? What's
So my my father takes me and my mother, my sister, to my other grandparents' home in another village. And when we arrive there, everybody's packing up their belongings and running away from the fighting, heading eastward in the direction of Russia. So my grandfather packs our things onto a horse and wagon, grabs photographs, by the way, and we end up in Lvov. Now it's called Lviv. And in the meantime, my dad and his brothers tried to join the Polish army, but of course, Poland is defeated in 1 month's time. He and his brothers joined this caravan of people that is constantly streaming out of Poland, heading to Russia. And then when he arrives, he finds us. He advertises in the newspaper looking for us, and he finds us. So we remained in Russia for over a year.
and then that time in Russia, is that, I mean, I can imagine that it's chaotic. I mean, do you recall? I mean, did you go to school that year, or are you sort of just in a constant state of worry? I mean, I can't even imagine what that
So
anxiety must be
I
like.
I never go to school until I come to this country. I didn't. I knew how to read and write from age 4, but anyway, so life in Russia was difficult because there was shortage of food and shortage of work, and there was an announcement made that any men who needed a job should report at the town hall. My 2 uncles went that day. My dad didn't because he didn't feel well that day. And when they arrived there was a marching band playing. They were they were instructed to sing nationalistic songs, and then they were marched to a nearby ravine, told to undress, and they were shot into the ravine. So that evening, we waited for my uncles to come home, but obviously they did not. And the other very tragic thing that happened to our family was that my baby sister got very ill. She contracted diphtheria. And of course, there was no medical treatment. So she died, and she was just 18 months old. And life was very difficult. I mean, there was shortage of food. So I remember times when my mother and I would go to the forest to pick mushrooms for food. She would make a mushroom stew, and sometimes my father would bring home a potato or a piece of bread. Um, so that's how life was there.
And then what was the sort of next iteration of the war for you? So you're in Russia, and then just give listeners a little bit of a background as to what happens next.
Yes. So then there is an order that states that all these Polish nationals that crossed the border, and there were about 200,000 Poles, Jews included, obviously, that crossed the border. And all these people, in order to be allowed to stay, have to take out Russian citizenship. And at that point, the family is divided. They don't know what to do. My grandparents decide they don't want to go back. So they stay
And
with
just
my,
to explain, sorry, I'm so sorry to cut you off. If you take Russian citizenship, you are basically relinquishing any hope of ever going back and recovering property. And,
yeah, that's exactly what my parents thought. But the people that stayed back were put onto trains and sent off to Siberia uh, and sent for slave labor. So that's where my grandmother and grandfather and aunt and uncle went. My grandmother died there. But we returned to Poland. When we returned, at first, my father was arrested because the Nazis thought he was a communist because we came from Russia. I remember my mother cooking, and every day she and I would walk to jail, bring him his food. In time, he was released. Um, Jews were forced to live in a ghetto, wear armbands to identify themselves as Jews. Every day there were roundups of people. Some were taken to the local cemetery, made to dig their own graves, shot. They were shot into the graves. Others were put onto trains or buses, and they were sent for slave labor. I remember one time we lived in the ghetto, and the Gestapo came to our apartment. They were searching for valuables, money, jewelry, furs, anything of value. They made everybody undress and they took whatever they wanted. And then my father heard that the Gestapo was looking for him. So that my parents decided that we would try to escape. So one night we left the ghetto. This was an open ghetto. It didn't have any walls around it. And we took our armbands and we went to the train station. Train stations were notoriously dangerous because that's where the plainclothes Gestapo would often be. But we managed to take a train and we ended up in another town where my mother had relatives. When we arrived at that town, we saw that the situation was very similar to what was happening in our town. And we realized that we wouldn't be safe there. So once again, my parents made a decision that we would try to escape. So this was August 1942. It was a very bright night. My father got a horse and wagon, and we started to drive out of town, but we didn't get far because suddenly in the distance, we saw Polish police approaching. We jumped off the wagon and we started to run. And the audience may be surprised. Why would we be afraid of the Polish police? And the reason for that was that, Poland was an anti-Semitic country, but not only that, there was a segment of the Polish police called the Blue Police. They were forced by the Nazis to cooperate and collaborate with the Nazis. So we were scared. We started to run, ended up in a field where potato plants were growing. We tried to hide, but of course, potato plants are short. Very quickly, we were found, we were beaten up, and we were made to return. And at that point, my parents realized they had run out of all options. There was no place to hide or run, no place to escape. And then they made this agonizing decision to give me away. Should I continue?
Yes, please.
Okay. They were able to convince a woman. She was a nanny to one of my cousins. Her name was Maria. They begged Maria to take me, and she agreed. So one day, my parents sat me down and explained that I was going to go with Maria, that I should be good, I should listen to her, I should be brave, and that we would be reunited very soon. So I left with Maria. I can't even imagine what that must have been like. I really have blocked that separation because I cannot imagine giving a child away, being a mother. It was such a heroic act on their part, so selfless. But anyway, I left with Maria. In the meantime, um, there was another instruction by the Nazis. They had 3 days to report in an area outside of Krakow called Wieliczka. My parents made another decision. They decided to go to this place separately. Their thinking was that if one of them if they separated, perhaps one of them would survive. So they went to this appointed place, and when they arrived there were about 12,000 people congregated in this big field. It was very hot. It was August, so there was no water, there was no food, and there was no place for them to sleep. They had to sleep on the ground. And then there was a selection, which meant that there was a group of Nazi officers who made a decision who would live and who would die. Approximately 1,000 men were selected for slave labor. My father was one of those men. Another approximately 1,000 old people and children were taken directly to the forest, and they were shot and killed. And the third group was put into 52 boxcars marked with the letter B, B for the death camp Belzec. So many of my relatives were victims of that death camp. My mother, my grandmother, my aunt, my cousins, and others from my family were victims. So this camp existed only 6 months. In that period of time, around 600,000 people were murdered. Only 2 people survived this camp.
Wow.
Yeah.
And at this time, you are living with Maria. You have no idea what's happened to your
Right. I'm
parents.
with Maria. Exactly.
When do you, I mean, I know I'm fast forwarding a bit, so we'll go back to the story, but when do you find out all of this about your parents? I'm sure, it wasn't easy to find out information. And there was, after the war, there was such chaos.
I did not know any of this. I did not know what happened to any of my family until my father found me in an orphanage. Um, that's when I found out, that my mother was murdered and some of my other family members also. But I really, my story has evolved over time. I did not know what happened to my mother and my grandmother and other family members until 2012. I was contacted by a young Polish historian who was getting her, was working on her PhD and studying the Holocaust. She contacted me. She found my website. And as a result of that connection, she has done tremendous amount of research. And I know exactly what happened to all my family members because of her research. And today, she's one of the most noted uh, researchers on the subject. Her name is Carolina Pons, Dr. Carolina Pons. Currently, she's doing research on the anti-Semitism that occurred after the war.
Oh, wow.
Mhm.
So it's 1942, you're living with Maria, and then what are those next 3 years like?
So I am with Maria. Maria has an apartment in the city in Krakow. And I remember very well being in that apartment. There were times when she'd go out in the evening, leave me alone, lock the door. There was no electricity, so I was in a pitch black apartment, frantic, crying, obviously not able to get out. And one day there was a sharp knock on the door. There was Maria opened the door, and there was a SS officer standing there. He said, "I have orders to search your apartment to see if you're hiding any Jews." He barged in. He looked under all the furniture. He turned some of the furniture over. He came up to me, held up my braid, wanted to know who I was. Maria said that I was her niece. She was taking care of me because her sister was sick. He looked at me with his chilling blue eyes, and he turned around and he left. And to this day, I remember what he looked like. He was blonde, light complexion, blue eyes. He was wearing shiny black leather boots that came up to his knees, and I could hear the clicking of his heels as he went down the steps. In the meantime, my father was sent to the Krakow ghetto. Every morning, he and other prisoners were marched to a local cable factory. My father worked on an assembly line, making electrical cables. He said he kept a little photograph of me in front of him on his machine. And he said the only reason he wanted to live was knowing he gave me away and he had to find me when the war would be over. He also said that he was starving because all that he was given to eat was black bread and a little bit of coffee in the morning and maybe a little soup at night. He also said he had a German foreman who every once in a while would slip my father an extra piece of bread. Of course, my father was so grateful for that. My father knew he had to make different arrangements for me because Maria said she could not keep me. But in the meantime, while my father was still living in the ghetto, the Nazis were building the concentration camp called Płaszów, on the outskirts of the city of Krakow. And when that camp was completed, the Krakow ghetto was liquidated. My father went to live in the concentration camp. And he knew he had to make different arrangements for me. Maria said she could not keep me. She was doing something very dangerous and risking her own life. So he was able to contact a cousin who was living on falsified Polish papers. And one day, I was brought to the ghetto fence, and my care was transferred from Maria to my cousin. My cousin was young, just 19 years old, very confident, very brazen. She was able to obtain a birth certificate from a Catholic priest of a little Catholic girl who died. And I took on this little girl's identity. I became her. So my new name was Krystyna Antoszkiewicz. My nickname was Krysia. My cousin's Polish name was Halina Wałkowska. So we both had Polish identity. She was very confident, and I remember taking the trolley car in Krakow, and she would always tell me to be quiet, not to speak, not to say one word, because Polish people were forbidden to sit in front of the trolley. That was reserved for Germans. Polish people had to sit in the back. Because she was so confident, and I guess she was just testing the system, we would sit in the front. And of course, she spoke German and I didn't. And we lived in another town outside of the city. She was very mean to me. She was cruel. She used to beat me with a fireplace poker. And when I cried for my mother, she would say, "Your mother is dead. She's never coming back." And I remember the time that she beat me so severely that all my fingernails turned black and they got infected. Eventually fell off. My nails fell off. There was a very nice woman who lived next door, a Polish Catholic woman. Her name was Janina. Janina was nice to me. You know, she made bandages for my fingers. She also let me play with her baby. Sometimes my cousin would make me sit outside on the front stoop all day long. She'd go out for the day. I was cold and hungry. Janina was good to me. She would sometimes give me bread to eat, and she would allow me to play with her baby. And my cousin had a boyfriend, a Polish boyfriend, who used to visit her. He lived in the same town. I think they met each other because this boyfriend had a shoe factory, and my cousin's father owned a leather factory in Krakow, and I think that's how they originally met. But one day she was going to the city to meet her boyfriend, and she took me with her. And when we arrived in Krakow, she took me into a church, and she told me to sit and wait for her while she was going to meet the boyfriend in a cafe. So I waited and waited and waited for hours, but she never returned. So finally, I walked out of the church. It was late afternoon. I noticed that the whole street was cordoned off. I crossed the street. There were little groups of people standing and talking, and I overheard them say that the Gestapo had come and they arrested everybody in that cafe. So here I was, 7 years old, walking up and down the street, crying, not knowing what to do. And suddenly a woman came up to me, and very quickly she put me under her cape and she said, "What's wrong? Why are you crying?" So I explained that I was with my cousin. She was in that cafe and now she was gone. I said, "Could you please take me to the bus? I was going to go back to my village." And she said, "No, no, you're too little." So she took me into the building, same building where the cafe was, but to the apartment to a woman by the name of Alicia Goom. Alicia asked me, "What happened? Who are you? Where are you from?" So I had a story that I rehearsed if I was ever captured. And I said that I was a daughter of a Polish officer and that both of my parents were killed in a bombing raid, and I came from Warsaw. She accepted my story and said I could stay, but I couldn't stay in that particular apartment because for three reasons. One was there was an SS officer living in the building. Another reason was that Alicia's mother was also living in the building, and she was part of the Polish resistance. And in her apartment, she ran a hospital. She had shortwave radios and she had ammunition. And the third reason I couldn't stay there was that when the Gestapo made an arrest, they always returned for the second time. So that early evening, the oldest son, Staszek, took me, and we walked for several miles, and we came to a farm that was owned and operated by the Catholic Church. And Alicia's brother-in-law was the administrator of that farm. So I remained on the farm. And I remember one time we slaughtered a pig, but Polish people were forbidden to kill animals for their own consumption. That was strictly reserved for Germans. But they had just slaughtered a pig, and the kitchen was a mess. They were cutting up the carcass, and suddenly there was a knock on the door. A neighbor came to tell us that the police, the Polish police, was on the way. It was not unusual for them to drop by to pick up cheese, butter, eggs, whatever they needed. So we very quickly, they cleaned everything up and we waited. And when they came, I was really scared because I was always afraid of any uniform. No matter what the uniform was, I was scared. I don't know what made me do this, but I said, give them vodka. So they pulled out the vodka, they were serving. And then I started to sing and dance. So they were drinking and they were amused by me and laughing, and they finally left. And my dad told of a situation that he found himself in concentration camp. In the middle of the night, he had to use the bathroom outdoors. He found a cigarette stub and he was smoking. A guard saw him and shot him in the face. The bullet lodged under my father's cheekbone and just stopped right there. Of course, my father couldn't get any medical treatment, so that bullet had to remain. And when the Nazis realized that they were losing, they wanted to destroy any evidence. So they burned this camp down to the ground. Today there's a monument and a museum there. And the remaining prisoners, well, before that happened, my father's job was to dig up the thousands of bodies that were buried all around this camp. So my father had to pull up the bodies, put them in a big mountain, and burn the bodies. He said it took him years to rid himself of the smell of the burning bones and flesh. So, but when that job was completed, the camp was burned down to the ground. My father ended up in 3 different concentration camps. And I remember when the war was coming to an end, because we were being liberated by the Russians and they were fighting all around the farm where I was. And finally it was decided that it was too dangerous to remain on the farm. So we moved out of from the farm and we went to live in Krakow. And I remember there were times when in the middle of the night we would hear a siren alerting us that it was going to be a bombing. Very quickly we had to put on our coats, light a candle, and everybody in the apartment building walked down the steps to a cellar, big cellar with dirt floor and wooden benches. We just sat around and we waited till another siren told us that we were safe to go back upstairs. So so we were liberated by the Russians, and when the war ended, my cousin's father found me, and he didn't keep me very long. He turned me over to the refugee center in Krakow. So that's where I was with 70 children like myself. I was 10 years old when the war ended, and there were more girls than boys because for obvious reasons, such as the fact that Jewish male babies had been circumcised. And so I remember one boy in particular was wearing a dress. He was so frightened, he wouldn't come out from under a table. He was so scared. And every day there were lists posted on the wall with names of survivors. And along came a woman, her name was Lena Kuchler. She came every day looking for her family. And she came across this room full of children and made a decision that she had to do something for the children. So in time, she was able to open 2 orphanages. I remember the night we left for the orphanage. We had to leave in the middle of the night because there were men picketing in front of the refugee centers, carrying hateful slogans saying that we all should have been murdered. We climbed into the trucks. They pulled tarpaulin covers. And one of the trucks was for children who had tuberculosis and other infectious diseases because the Polish hospitals refused to take Jewish children. So they had to open a second orphanage for them. So I went to live in an orphanage, and it was only the high school age children were sent to public school, but every day they came back, they were beaten up by Polish kids. Nina went to the school pleading with the principal and the teachers to protect the children, but they didn't. And because Lena was so afraid that our home would be attacked, she obtained ammunition. The other orphanage was attacked 3 different times, and finally was decided that it was too dangerous to leave it open. So they closed that orphanage, and those children came to live with us. And one evening, a Polish lady came up, knocked on the door. She came to tell us that our home was going to be attacked. So the older children took their positions on the balcony and on the terrace. They waited, and Polish men came. They were on horseback. They were carrying fire torches, and they were shooting. But the children were able to protect the home. And one day, Lena went back to pick up some provisions at the refugee center. She overheard a man asking about his child. She said to him, "Can you describe what your daughter looks like?" He described a girl with blonde hair, braids, green eyes, and a birthmark on her left thigh. And Lena said to him, "I think I have your daughter." So she came back to the orphanage, called me down to her office, and said, "I have wonderful news. Your dad has survived, and he's coming." And I always remember the reunion with my dad, because when I first saw him, I was so scared of him. I hadn't seen him for about 3.5 years. He looked like a skeleton. He was hugging, kissing me, telling me he was going to take me. I didn't really want to go, because for the first time, I had friends, and Lena was our mother. We called her mother. My father was really sick. He couldn't take me right away, so he rented a room nearby. I saw him every day. We got reacquainted, and in time he was able to take me. And we went back to our town. We moved into my grandparents' apartment with 3 friends of my father's who survived. But we weren't safe there either, because there were notes posted on our front door saying we would be murdered. 2 of my father's good friends were murdered after the war. They were young men driving in a car. They were ambushed and shot. And my father went to the police chief asking for protection. And the police chief said all he could do is to give my father a gun. So my father slept with a gun. And in time, my father made a decision that we had to leave, because it was very unsafe. We moved back to Krakow. And by that time, my grandfather and my aunt and uncle returned from Siberia. We moved in with them. And we were there for a short while. But my dad realized that Poland was really not a place for us to be. We were not welcome. It was very dangerous. Poland was a big morgue, you know. He made a decision that we needed to leave. Of course, it wasn't a simple matter as packing up our bags and leaving. He had 2 brothers. One was living in Palestine, and the other one was in the States. He came up to me and said, "Where do you want to go?" And I, without hesitation, I said, "I want to go to America." And he said, "Why? Why do you want to go there?" And I said, "I heard that money grew on trees." So no idea where that came from. But of course, it took about 2 years for us to get the proper documentation. We had distant relatives in New Jersey who sent us, they sponsored our coming to the United States. And basically, these documents stated that my father couldn't support himself and support me, that the family would take care of us, so that we would never become a burden to this country and have to go on public assistance. So in March of 1947, we sailed on a marine transport boat, very rough crossing, because the Atlantic is stormy in March. I particularly love the cafeteria, because I love the vending machine where I could put a nickel in and pull out a Milky Way. And of course, the other food that I loved was red Jello. I thought it was magical food. So we settled in New Jersey. I had never been to school. I was 10 years, I was almost 12 when I came. My uncle took me to school to register me for school. Right there in the school office, he said, what name do you want? You have to have an American name. So very quickly, I had not thought about that before, but I came up with the name Jeanette because we had a cousin who was French. She lived in Paris. She used to visit in the summer. She was beautiful, glamorous. She had long red nails, and her name was Jeanette. So I said Jeanette, and my uncle turned to the school secretary and he said, her name is Janet. So that's how I became Janet.
Huh.
And I started elementary school in April. Fifth, sixth grade, combination grade. But by June, I was promoted to seventh grade, which was correct grade for me. And we had another really serious problem because we came on a 90-day visitor's visa. Actually, it was a medical visa for my father to have his bullet removed. We had another visa to go to Venezuela in 90 days. The only way we could remain in this country is if my father married an American citizen. So the family looked around and they found him a wife. So in that very short period of time, I had a new stepmother, new name, new appearance because they cut my hair, new friends, new language, everything was new. And so, life certainly changed dramatically once we were here.
Wow, there are so many questions and thoughts. First of all, that's an incredible story. Did your father and stepmother stay together?
Yes, they did stay together until my father's death in 1978. They were married 32 years.
And so, did you ever find out what happened to Maria or your cousin, or did you ever get reunited with
Right.
them?
So Maria, I understand she was helpful to other Jewish families, and she was okay. Actually, the family that it was my grandfather's sister that she saved, and when the war ended, they helped her, they supported her, and I don't know what happened to my cousin after she was arrested. Um, my dear friend Carolina Pons, who did all the research, she really wasn't able to find exactly what happened to her. She thought that her parents emigrated to South America, and that perhaps that's what happened with her. Maybe she did immigrate. Otherwise, I don't really know.
Yeah. In thinking about just your legacy and the legacy of, so many Holocaust survivors and the many more that didn't survive, for the next generation, what are the salient points? What do you hope to impart in terms of people listening, in terms of one, how people can think about this, something that's just so far out of our imagination, and two, I often feel like people are stuck for both words and also actions. There's a sense of, what can we do in just the wider sense? And it always feels like nothing that one can do is enough. So I'm curious just to end off for the last question of, what do you hope to impart and what would you say to somebody saying, what should I do? How should I think about this moving forward?
I think genocide education is vital. I think knowledge is so important. I think people need to understand history. Of course, we always say never again, and sadly, it's happening today. Um, so I think it's so important to know the history, know this what happened, and and I know people feel so powerless and not know what to do and how to help. I think the importance of being kind, as simple as kindness, because kindness has a ripple effect. And when we think about like what can we do? We can't change, laws per se, but we can help to maybe change another person's views by being caring and loving and kind, and try to become active, try to maybe join organizations that are doing the right things that you are passionate about. Maybe write letters to your Congress people, and any way you feel like you're contributing will be helpful. In terms of younger people, students, befriending a student that is new in school, or someone who's being teased or bullied, or don't participate in laughing at ethnic jokes. Just even things that seem very trivial are important, to stand up to any kind of injustice and to be an upstander, not a bystander.
Well, Janet Singer Applefield, thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thank you.